This week, to be closer to China. China has a huge rural population of around 600 million. The government initiated rural land reform in 2014 to grant farmers greater rights to benefit from the collective land in villages. The pilot program is energizing the country's rural revitalization strategy. For almost 4 decades, the Communist Party of China has been focusing on rural land reform. But why then, after such a long period of time, under continuous CPC rule, are rural issues still a continuing problem?
当中问题在这10年当中取得了很大的进展，但是呢，还没有从根本上加以解决。这涉及到一些我们讲的根深蒂固的一些利益问题、国民收入分配格局问题和我们的体制机制的一些问题。
What's the history of rural land reform? Why the necessity of the reform?
把土地的承包经营权分给一家一户，那么农民能够自主的来从事生产，也能够自主的来销售农产品。这样的话，农民的积极性得到充分的发挥，得到充分的调动。
How is the rural revitalization strategy designed? What are its achievements and challenges?
中国农村土地制度设计对实现中国工业化、城镇化、信息化、农业现代化、市化同步发展，它的效果是非常明显的。
This week, be closer to China. Can rural land reform bring about rural revitalization? When Deng Xiaoping began market reforms in 1978 and individual land ownership was required for economic efficiency, a leasehold system with operational rights was set up. Rural lands in China are divided into 3 groups: agricultural lands, collective construction lands, and barren lands. And over time, financial exploitation of rural land became a key issue, especially as land values skyrocketed. This led to great wealth in urban areas, but ironically, farmers, the backbone of the communist revolution, were left behind. Everyone knows this has to be rectified. Currently, pilot programs setting up mechanisms for rural land use rights to be transferred via markets are being carried out. Questions remain, such as, what happens to land rights if a farmer moves to a city and becomes a migrant worker? What happens when a farmer dies? And how can farmers' rights be better protected, especially from land expropriation by local government? Rural land issues are real and troublesome. There are indeed challenges in this round of rural land reform, but they bring us closer to China. Shaogang Village in Anhui Province is renowned for pioneering the household responsibility system, or household-based contract responsibility system, in 1978. Now, 4 decades later, China's rural reform has entered another new stage.
As the right of land management was transferred to the farmers, the issue of hunger was resolved. But individual farming on the fragmented fields was not the way to bring more wealth to the farmers.
Since 2014, land use rights have been transferable as the right to property. And again, Shaogang Village is among the pioneers. Though villagers are still contracting the farmland, more than half of their land has been leased to farming companies and experts for which they are paid rent.
In such a large field, if the pesticides are sprayed manually, I'd be afraid 10 farmers would have to work the whole day. The machine can finish the job within an hour.
The transfer of farmland management rights enables farmers to subcontract, lease, exchange, or swap their land use rights, or join shareholding entities with their farmland. The reforms aim to enhance peasant wealth without abandoning collective ownership. Now, over 1/3 of contracted farmland is put up for transfer in the market. To boost incentives for long-term investment in farmland, authorities promise to lengthen land contract terms to the 2050s.
承包经营权的话是
Contracted management rights represent a major rural reform measure taken after the reform and opening up. The lease for the first round of the contract was 15 years. A 15-year lease generally ended in 1997. Then for the second round, the contract was renewed for 30 years, generally to 2027 or 2028. The report of the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China proposed it should remain unchanged for a long time, which means 30 more years when the lease is due. The latest development, another 30 years for the third round of lease contract.
A complete rural contract term starting from 1978 to the mid-21st century is 75 years. It's around the average life expectancy. It's rather long-term. Secondly, it's relatively stable. What does it mean? For a family, even if there's only one member left, no matter what, their land rights cannot be infringed upon.
And so it's long-term, but it is the 75-year period. So if the children and grandchildren inherit, by the end of the 75 years, it would all revert back. The contract would be over, and the family, which might be in cities, would lose their right after the 75 years, and it would revert back to the collective ownership. Is that right?
It is entirely up to the farmers whether they give up their managerial rights. In other words, without a perfect social security system, the Chinese government is against or does not recommend contracted farmers letting out their entire land managerial rights easily. This includes ownership, contract and management rights. In this regard, we must take precautions. The Chinese government has repeatedly stressed that land reform is an arduous journey. To tackle the problem, we must be patient. In our relevant policy and system designs, we proposed strict protection of farmers' land contract rights because it is the core of farmers' rights. We call it sustained and strict protection, because if the farmers want to cultivate the land themselves, they are entitled to all contracted management rights, including ownership, usage rights, a right to earnings, transfer rights, or partial disposal rights. If not, they can transfer the rights to a third party. In that case, they can decide on the rent and enjoy the right to get the land back at any time. All these rights are protected. Third, the biggest feature of the separation of rights is that management rights can be transferred. Transfer of management rights between different entities is the core and the most innovative aspect of China's separation of rural land rights. Farmers from Sichuan can till lands in Jiangsu or Guangdong. What's the premise? I have the transferred management rights in Guangdong or Jiangsu or some other city, county or village. With the transferred rights, I can manage the local farmland to grow rice, wheat or business crops. If my proceedings from land management are not necessarily lower than non-agricultural revenues, then I have contributed my share in improving resource allocation efficiency of the management rights, labor and land productivity.
In 2018, the pilot program on farmland expands to 300 counties with the goal of basically completing the reform by 2021. Though progress has been slow, China has been looking for years to reform landholding rights for rural citizens as it promotes more efficient large-scale farming. At the same time, the reform of collective construction land is also underway, with a pilot program being conducted in 33 counties. Due to its complexity, the progress is much slower than that on farmland.
Deserted, collapsed, uninhabited homes. This village is in central China's Jiangxi province. As industrialization in urban areas attracted farmers to migrate to and live in cities, the number of uninhabited rural homes and unused homesteads allocated to farmers is increasing. To develop the potential of homestead lands, a trial reform was initiated. Owners of homestead sites now have financial monetizing options. They can receive payment for the transfer of their rights, or use the site as an investment to become a shareholder and receive dividends, or collateralize it for bank loans to finance their own startup businesses.
What are the problems that the current land reform is addressing?
Rural homestead land faces more challenges. In China, when it comes to rural homestead land, the original purpose was to strictly protect the rights of farmers and members of the rural community. As long as you are a member of a rural community, you can get a piece of rural homestead land for free to build your own house. However, people are constantly moving. A huge number of rural people migrate to cities, leaving rural houses or rural homestead land idle. Meanwhile, some urban dwellers would like to enjoy their elderly life in a village, but according to our current land management system, they cannot acquire rural land for residential housing. Such a system cannot meet the demands of two-way migration between urban and rural areas. That's why it needs reform. In rural areas, we still have a vast number of construction land for commercial purposes. These lands were set apart by the Chinese government years ago for township and village enterprises. In accordance with China's current land system, these land rights are exclusively owned by the rural community, and no rent or transfer is allowed. Obviously, such a plan serves no good to increase the utilization of rural construction land. This is the same scenario for some other insufficiently used rural lands. That is why rural lands require reforms in property rights. Another factor is industrialization. China's urbanization rate has reached 57%. Going forward, this number will keep rising. Urbanization and industrialization require more land resources. In the past, we had a land expropriation system. When the state acquires land from a rural community, the allocation of earnings needs to be rectified. Our next step is to reform the land expropriation system.
Let's talk about some literal projects that represent these reforms.
For example, we went to research the listed collective land in Liuyang, Hunan province. Township and village enterprises used to be prosperous there. Collective land for commercial purposes used to make up a big proportion of the economy. Their reform was to auction the idle collective land. Investors who have a need can take part in the bidding. In this way, the value of land gets enhanced. The state and rural community will first distribute the appreciated value. When the rural community gets the money, it will in turn further allocate it between the collective community and farmers. The proportion varies. Roughly 10 to 20% goes to the local government, 70 to 80% goes to the farmers. The farmers may decide to distribute the money again between the collective and themselves. For some areas, 20 to 30% will be collectively owned to develop a collective economy or rural public affairs, and the remaining 70 or 80% will go to farmers in accordance with the number of farmers. Finally, we will draw on the experience from dozens of counties and make a national plan. An allocation ratio between state and farmers will be set. We can call it a land proceeds adjustment fund or land added value adjustment tax. When the pilot projects get fulfilled, we will make evaluations to settle the final plan. This is the issue of allocation between state and farmers.
What are some of the problems and issues, for example, when a farmer becomes a migrant worker and literally moves maybe hundreds of miles? So how can they continue to have a right in their land, or if there's rent, how can they be sure they're paid? What kind of legal obligations?
China's rural land is collectively owned. Its main feature is the collective ownership by all members. The land belongs to each and every member of a collective community, and they share benefits from their property rights. Under our current policy, even if farmers migrate to the cities, they still remain members of the collective community. If the community's land gets listed with added value, they can surely share the earnings. When farmers migrate to cities, a majority of them still have their families and household registrations in rural areas as migrant workers, so we still treat them as members of the rural community, equal to the people who remained in the villages. They enjoy equal rights when it comes to the allocation of collective land proceeds.
Ways should be explored to protect migrant farmers' land management rights, the use of rights to residential lands, and the right to earnings from the collective community. Farmers cannot be denied these three rights after they migrate to the cities unless they voluntarily give them up. Without personal permission, no organization or person has the right to rid farmers of these three rights. That's my first point. Secondly, we need research and analysis. When people flood into cities, is there a means of land redemption with farmers' permission? For example, farmers may want to give the land back to the community with received compensation. But who should pay for the compensation? It makes sense for the community to pay. However, in rural areas, especially underdeveloped areas, the community does not have the means to pay the money. That's a problem. These problems are still under discussion during our system design process.
A great deal of corruption has gone on, certainly in the past, between local government officials and local developers. They get the land from the farmers at a very, very cheap price, which the local government enforces. They work with the local developer. The city gets, the local government gets higher revenue for their fiscal income. The developer will resell it, make an enormous profit, and one suspects in many cases they'll be under-the-table payments to the officials in some sense.
I believe a vibrant community must meet two conditions. First, clearly defined collective assets. That is, who owns what and in how big a proportion should be made crystal clear. Ownerless lands are most susceptible to infringement and most easily lead to corruption. Second, within the community, farmers should have their say. For that to happen, they must have their rights of decision-making, participation, and supervision, instead of letting a few cadres have a dominant say. These two conditions must be met.
The party secretary of the local township or collective enterprise will have significantly power, like a CEO, to negotiate with investors or big companies. In that circumstance, there's fertile room for corruption. And so what can be done to limit the capacity of rural party chiefs to engage in corrupt activities where they're getting kickbacks for various pricing mechanisms, and farmers are significantly disadvantaged?
When land gets listed, how can one implement fair trade policies and the allocation of proceeds through upgrading the rural governance system? I believe the best way is to ensure openness and transparency. Which piece of land will go public? How can it be traded? How should one set the trading price? The whole process should be open. Party organization at the rural grassroots level should play its role of supervision. Within the collective community, democratic management should be applied. Under the supervision of the grassroots party organization and community members, managers of the collective community should act accordingly and be open and transparent so as to avoid insider trading and deter village cadres from corruption.
Wang Fang is reaping a bumper harvest of strawberries. In 2017, the 44-year-old acquired 50 mu, or roughly 3 hectares or 8 acres of farmland in her home village in the Jinqiao township of Chengdu City to plant the popular fruit.
Some 10 years ago, we relied on traditional labor and intensive agriculture for a living. Now that modern-style agriculture is bringing more economic benefits, I decided to seek opportunities back home.
Wang said these strawberries, all cultivated in greenhouses, can bring in about $300,000 annually. During the harvest season, she employs about 60 villagers. Each of them can earn about $475 a month. Besides local farmers like Wang, Jinqiao has also attracted a growing number of outside investors to develop industries. Now the township has become a hub for various fruits.
Rural revitalization means that all the villagers can get rich. How can they get involved in the development? Take this peach farm, for example. It's owned by an agricultural expert, but local farmers can run related businesses here. In this way, different people can benefit from the same land.
Rural revitalization is a national strategy that was put forth at the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China in October 2017. The objectives for sequential stages are specified. By 2020, no one in China should live under the existing poverty line, and rural productivity and agricultural supply will improve substantially. By 2035, rural areas should see a basic modernization of agriculture, and all Chinese people in rural areas as well as in cities should have equal access to basic public services, and by 2050, rural areas will have a strong agricultural sector, beautiful countryside, and well-off farmers.
The rural revitalization strategy adopted by the Chinese government is the guiding principle for work related to agriculture, rural areas and farmers for now and in the future. During this process, China's land system will surely play its due role. I keep emphasizing that the premise for the system to play its role is the separation of rural ownership rights, contract rights and management rights.
I did a book 10 years ago. I wrote about Zhonghua Sanshunian, 30 years of reform. And right then, agriculture was a big problem and a big concern, and I had some of these same questions being discussed 10 years ago. So what is it about the land in China that has caused such deep challenges over such a long period of time?
While we designed this land system, we factored in the management system, including protection policies for state and agriculture, increased our rural labor productivity, land productivity, and resource allocation efficiency, so it pushed China's agriculture to be more competitive rather than serving as an obstacle. In fact, thirdly, thanks to this system arrangement, we avoided the premature aging of agriculture seen in Japan and the Democratic Republic of Korea. Aging agriculture is quite an outstanding issue for Japan. The average age for people working in agriculture in Japan is 67 years. Though China also faces this aging issue like other countries in the world, thanks to China's reform of its land system, the problem for China is not that serious. Meanwhile, China's land system is open. We stress that rural land should be used for agricultural purposes, we specify whom it can be used by, and China's vision is world-leading. Japan adopted a narrow policy framework that rural land can only be used by farmers. Simply put, farmers can till the land. While in China, as long as new management entities do not destroy the arable land or production, whether you fix houses in cities or operate lathes in a factory, if you want to grow the land and devote yourself to the agricultural industry, you'll get the permission. On this issue, China to a great extent avoided aging agriculture, subsidiary businesses and part-time farming, so I believe China's innovation of its land system has been successful.
So to attract the best people to rural areas, to develop rural businesses or new ideas, to attract the best, you've got to give them the opportunity to own it themselves. The best ones are not going to come to be part of a collective.
In rural areas, we can also explore a mixed economy. Under such circumstances, be it a rural collective that I have been researching or cooperatives, we have a system described as round on the outside but square on the inside. That is to say, cooperatives or collectives, on the one hand, enjoy a market economy. For example, entrepreneurs can enjoy ownership rights transferred by others, considering their entrepreneurship, talent, and labor capital. People can transfer their ownership or use their rights. On the other hand, to a certain extent, your capital and all else belong to you. However, we're bound into a community of shared interests, or an alliance. Within the collective, allocations are still made in accordance with the principles of the collective. Then we need to consider how to create a beneficial institutional environment. including the introduction of talents, taxation, and other financial policies to make it grow and prosper, and during that process to integrate its strength with local strengths to build a win-win regime. Ultimately, our exploration is for all to win. Going forward, growth features multifacets and diversification, including a collective economy, private and mixed economies. In such a context, the formation of a reasonable property landscape with optimal allocation of resources will serve as a solid foundation for rural revitalization.
Booming industries are the foundation for the rural revitalization strategy. Given the current production capacity, in order to develop industries in the countryside, we have to improve the competitiveness of agricultural products. Given bigger plots, farmers can earn more with higher output efficiency. In this process, labor productivity, land output efficiency, and resource allocation efficiency all get increased. So I believe for the application of the rural revitalization strategy with regard to land resource utilization, the key is to separate ownership rights from contract and management rights. And in the process, a new generation of agricultural business owners will keep emerging and growing. The successful cases of individual household farms, family-held plantations, cooperatives, and agricultural enterprises have demonstrated the advantage of the separation of rights in China's land system. Secondly, in terms of its management system, we have also created a diversified, sharing, and mutually beneficial system. Deepening land reforms will facilitate the growth of new types of agricultural business ownership within the rural revitalization framework.
Should the question be, what's the most efficient for the future? Not, well, we have to keep it because we have the socialist name. Well, at one point the market was not socialist, and now the market is socialist. So, you know, some of the old ways of thinking should be subservient more to what's the most efficient for the farmers and for the whole economic system.
But if the system remains fixed and closed, it is of no vitality. That is to say, going down the road, the trend is to be flexible and open. We will explore the new collective economy in a flexible and open property rights landscape. We must balance rural-urban development to introduce advanced factors of production of the cities, including premium resources, talents, capital, technology, etc., to rural areas and tap the potential of the broad rural areas. So in order to protect farmers' interests and increase their assets in optimizing the allocation of factors, flowing resources and changing property rights landscape, we need to explore whether one can be a member, a quasi-member of a collective community and get restrained accordingly. A village member always shoulders certain obligations while enjoying certain rights. This is a complete system design and organization innovation facing rural revitalization. The next step is to energize the rural collective community with farmers' assets better protected in an open and flexible manner. On the one hand, features of a community remain. On the other hand, it is accessible to market vitality. That is what I hope for, a new type of collective economy for socialism with Chinese characteristics.
By law, China protects private property rights, including private ownership of real property. At the same time, rural land in China has long been owned collectively. In recent decades, the farmland was allocated to farmers in small plots on 30-year lease contracts. Under the current far-reaching reforms, markets will be created for the lease of contracted farmland and for the transfer of farmland use rights, enabling farmers to subcontract, lease, exchange, or swap their land use rights or join shareholding entities with their farmland, all of which generates new incomes for farmers, all without abandoning ultimate state ownership. The reform will provide farmers more income from their rights on collectively owned lands and help close the wealth gap with urban residents. It is not uncommon that farmers working for large companies are paid rent for their land as well as salaries for their labor. Finally, it seems the problems of rural land may be heading for solutions. Certainly there will be challenges. We will be watching for both on Closer to China.